Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia, and we're going to be continuing to celebrate our 12 Days of Christmas special featuring our Day 3 list, or the top 5 new units that I want to see added to the game Total War 3 Kingdoms. And kicking this off, we're going to have to set some ground rules, or at least some frameworks, for how we're going to do discussion here. Now, there are obviously tons of units that I want to see added in, and I want to see new units during each DLC, and perhaps free LC factions, not a guarantee after what happened with Shixie. So we could do a lot of things with this video. We could talk about what some unique units for a certain faction might be, or in this case, I want to actually talk about the nature of combat and battles in Total War 3 Kingdoms right now, and some way to improve it, and perhaps some of the most common unit that should be in the game that I feel like is currently missing. So the units that you will see here today might not necessarily represent some unique unit that could show up for future DLCs and free LCs, as we talk about those in our Day 1 and Day 2, but rather we're just going to look at things a little bit historically to see how we can implement some of the key historical units or weapon types that's currently missing in the game. So, the first type of unit that I want to see added into the game is actually a very simple infantry unit. And I want this to be a unit using this weapon pictured here. And this weapon is called the Juancho Dal. And the name is pretty straightforward. Dal, it means saber, in particularly a straight back saber. As you can see in the picture, the blade has only one edge and the other side is a straight back. And Huanshou means a circular head, and that really is what's shown at the end next to the handle, as you have this circle there that kind of help you with your grip. When you swing, it catches your hand so you don't lose your sword. There's not much of a scabbard in front. That's because this is actually an artifact, so that piece, if it's decorative, was probably removed. You see the entire blade. It's pretty well preserved, and this was a very popular weapon during the entire Han Dynasty. So during the early periods of Spring Autumn into Warring State, sword was pretty popular because you didn't need militaries in the scale that the Han army will eventually need. Sword is a difficult weapon to make. You need basically 2 edges on the weapon. So when the army size grew, Dao became more popular in China. Dao and Ji, and Qiang, basically spear, Ji, which is a variation of a spear, and then these Dao right here. And you might notice these sabers are very long. They're usually between 1 meter to maybe 1.2 meters long, especially for the kingdom of Shuhan and the kingdom of Wei. And the reason why their weapons are that length is because this sword, or this Dao, let's call it saber, was designed to fight cavalry. As you can see, you either slice or chop with this weapon, or you can thrust and poke with this weapon. And the design of it being this long, it helps it cleave a horse's head off. So we talked about Zhanma Jian when the giant blades were introduced, and that was kind of counter cavalry. Well, that style of blade, being really wide and really thick, did not exist during the Three Kingdom period. So that's a later invention, and it would be a kind of waste of material. What they had instead was these long, thin swords or blades. I keep calling them swords, but these are really sabers. And these weapons were pretty much the standard issue of the day. Now, we didn't talk about the Kingdom of Wu. So from the artifacts that were found, the Huanshou Dao for the Kingdom of Wu tend to be a little shorter, around 90 centimeters or like 0.9 meters. And the reason why they were designed to be shorter is they fought a lot less cavalry, and they also fought on ships quite more often. So they can't have too long of a blade, that way you can't swing it effectively. So that's kind of the evolution of weaponry during this period. During about the first 300 years of the Han Dynasty, both the Eastern Han and the Western Han, the main opponent for the entire empire was the Xiongnu. And that means you're fighting against cavalry all the time. So weapons like spears, weapon like ji, which is a spear plus a little dagger that cuts the hoof of the horse, and these long narrow blades, these were popular. Aside from these, crossbows and archers are also popular weapons, bows, because all these counter cavalry. So these become the mainstay weapons, and fancy things like the sword became more ceremonial and were used by generals, but they were just less standard issue. But as we can see in the game, units do not really use this type of long, thin blades in the game. You either have the big sabers or you have the double edged swords, both of which I don't think are super representative of the period. And if we could see this one added in, it can be more historical. And these were designed to be one-handed weapons instead of the 斩马剑, which in game is a two-hander, which means the unit that use these can have a shield, which is very essential for Total War 3 Kingdom in terms of gameplay, because if you don't have shields, ranged unit will rip you apart and you can't really use them in the game. So this is one type of weapon, or technically a type of unit, that I want to see being featured, and they should definitely get a bonus against cavalry, similar to how spears, jis, and even 斩马剑 gets a bonus stat to their attack when they're fighting cavalry. Then we enter another topic here, and this topic is also historical. We're talking about naval battles. Now, I have been saying we don't need naval battle added into the game because that might not be something feasible for the developers. But historically speaking, naval battle was definitely an important piece of history. It didn't happen very frequently. Most people quote Tribute being a huge naval battle. It really wasn't. There was really no major engagement on the actual Yangtze River. It was during the winter. Both sides were basically just making camp, and the success of the Battle of Tribute mainly happened on land. I would say 90% of that actual battle happened on land. It was basically a surprise attack onto Cao Cao's harbor, and the fighting spilled over from the ship that was docked there into the land. And Zhou Yu sent many pursuit teams across the river to cut off Cao Cao's retreat, and that was pretty much the battle. But there were naval battles during Three Kingdom, and ships that look kind of like this did exist. Now, this is not a historical drawing. This is an educated guess based on the description of these ships. And these ships are called Lou Chuan. And Chuan means ship. Lou means towers or buildings. So these are kind of a small fort on a platform in the river that floated and can carry up to 3,000 men for some of the Wu Navy. They had these 5-story tall tower ship that housed 3,000 men inside, and you had archers in these platforms doing battle. So I understand there's currently no naval battle, and I don't want to see naval battle like what we saw with Shogun 2. Not that it wasn't well done with Shogun 2, it's fine. I didn't personally enjoy them, but I think it's not a bad effort. You also had naval battles during Empires, I believe. It's been too long since I played that game, but I vaguely remember there was actual naval battles during Empires. I don't actually want that. I don't want the combat of your unit disembarking to fight in a river in China, given that some of the river were pretty wide at certain points. Like you had the Yangtze River and the Yellow River that had like perhaps 8 or 9 mile width at some of the widest points. So there's plenty of space to do battle. But at the same time, we're talking about a river combat, not a ocean or sea combat. And what mainly happened was that you had these tower boats, and you also had small ships around them to support them. And you had basically a floating fortress that shot arrows out at your enemy. So you all heard the story of the Battle of Tribute where Zhuge Liang borrowed the arrows from Cao Cao with his empty ships with straws and stole all that arrow. Well, archery is the mainstay of naval combat during the day. Of course, different ships did ram each other. We're going to see that actually for the next unit. But what I want to actually see for the game implementation is that when two armies meet in the river, have a special map that is a flotation of different ships. And what you can have is each side, the commanding general and his retinue can be in one of these Lou Chuan, which is a giant square platform at one end of the river. And then you would have some other ship platforms that could ferry your men towards their platform at the risk of getting shot. And if you happen to have fire arrows, then you're going to have a huge advantage in that you can burn down enemy ships, and the ship burns and sinks, all the unit on them will die. And that seems very fair. And if you have marine units or special unit that are naval units, they could swim and they'll take less casualties if their ship should sink to fire arrows. And that could make for more defensible chokes on the river, and also a good way to avoid just delegating all river battles, because you can imagine you get into a fight, both side has at least one of these platforms, and then they would have small ship they can use as ferries to send men into the other platform with a victory point in it. And you could still use your units as though you were using them on land, except for the map would just be adjusted for naval travel and some key advantages between naval units. And cavalries will become a lot weaker because you can't flank charge anyone, because you still have to be ferried over by these smaller ships. So that's just a thought that I had. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it'll just be a neat way to implement naval battle to keep things historical, as well as to add some more interesting battle mechanics to the game. Now, about the ships that ferry people over, you have something called the Mengchong, and the drawing here is very simple, but these are just basically fast transport ship used to ram enemy ships, and that's what I thought we could use for the transports during the naval battles. And this way you can also have a very defensive army set up to hold chokes, where the commanding general perhaps is a strategist with a bunch of archers that have fire arrows, and you have a huge advantage in just wearing out the enemy transport so they can't cross. And it also could make, marine and naval units actually a thing where they don't take casualties if they lose their ship and they sink. They can still swim. Whereas regular units, maybe cavalry, if they're on one of these transports and they get burned and they sink, the whole unit is destroyed. I think that seems a very fair practice. And we can also have an actual battle of Chibi in the future if we play something similar like this. So kind of like a land encampment battle, except for every time you have a naval engagement, you have two of these Lochuan with many Mengchong in between. So these two units here are basically my idea of how to take care of naval battle. And if it should happen in the future, you can thank me then. And then moving forward, we have some siege weapons, and we want to talk about how siege weapons are currently being treated in the game and how I think we could maybe adjust them to make things a little bit better. So what we have here is a very iconic Chinese siege weapon called the Yunti, which means cloud ladders, and it's kind of in between a siege tower and a mobile ladder, and that's exactly what it's designed as. So those siege towers you see in game that were added in, those were not historical. China did not use that. China used these. You had a base platform where you hit the men. You did not have them climb inside. That's a waste of time. And then you push the thing to the wall with a spring-loaded ladder. And you cut the rope, the ladder flings up, hooks onto the wall, and the troop inside start climbing. That's what happened. So where are these things in the game? They're not there. We have siege towers instead. Now, tower structure were used. They were just not put on wheels. Towers were often constructed during long sieges so that they can look over the enemy wall and shoot at them. It was used during the Battle of Guandu, and Cao Cao responded by building trebuchets to knock down these towers. But that's something that's slightly different. And speaking of siege weapons and siege weaponry in the game, siege weapons are a little bit too strong. Trebuchets, crossbows, even the juggernauts. I know that one's kind of situational, but in terms of trebuchets and crossbows, they're way too strong in all situations. And they actually don't make a lot of sense. Like, I wouldn't have a regular army carry 3 sets of trebuchets or 12 trebuchets and travel with it all across China during the campaign. You might not be sieging, and it's just pieces of lumber. What usually happens is if you are in a siege, you start building your siege weapons to fight. And then after the siege is over, you take them apart. You don't carry that siege weapon with you for, ambush battle that will happen. That part doesn't make a lot of sense. And plus, siege weapon in the game gives you such a huge advantage on the open field battle that sometime during my Let's Plays, people ask me to not use siege weapon because they change game dynamics so much and make the game a lot easier than it is. So we can maybe change that. And the suggestion I have is that all siege weapons, including these towers and ladders, have to be used during only siege battles. And what you can do is, instead of the current system where you wait turns to build your desired siege effect, is you have something where you spend your military supply to instantly build your desired siege weapons for your battle. But then you don't recover that supply afterward. So if you perhaps want to rush down a siege of a city, you would maybe spend 30 supply for each trebuchet. So perhaps you can trade 90 supplies for 3 trebuchets, use that for that battle, but then right after the battle you only have 10 supplies and you have to recover that supply for the army before you move on, or else you can't do a lot of things, because supplies is something that's currently being used for replenishment, but I think it can be used a little bit better, as in trading them for siege weapons instead of waiting for a turn, because it also kind of make enemy AI armies kind of irrelevant, because you can see an enemy army approach one of your cities, you see that your city is walled, they don't have a siege weapon, you know that city is at least safe for 2 turns. If it's this system, they have military supplies with them, they can trade that supply for different types of siege weapons, whether it's sapping, whether it's the battering ram, whether it's these ladders, whether it's crossbows, whether it's trebuchets or juggernauts. You get those units then, rather than you bring those units with your strategists all the time. It will also make strategists a lot weaker in the game if they're not the only units that can recruit siege weapons. Therefore, it will also open up army composition variety and also make open field battles more interesting, because when you're the attacker and the AI's defender, they will no longer rush at you just because you have a siege weapon. So I think it's a pretty neat way to just balance the game out a little bit, also add a little bit more use for military supplies. So this is the unit that we're going to talk about, and we're also just going to use this point to touch up on siege. Finally, we're going to talk about an actual unit. And this unit here is called Xindongyung, or sometimes called 先登死士. 先登 just means first one to climb, first one to arrive, kind of a vanguard unit. Ying is a unit encampment, so it's like a group of 先登 units. 死士 means those who are maybe given a crime where they were going to get executed anyways. They're given a chance to kind of redeem themselves, to go fight. And if they do well in the battle as the vanguard units, their death sentence is relieved, so they fight really hard. And this unit in particular is actually historically relevant. It was a unit that served Yuan Shao, and these were the unit that crushed Gong Sun Zan's White Horse fellas. So Gong Sun Zan and Yuan Shao will do battle, and Yuan Shao will win that one, mainly because a group of 先登死士 wiped out the White Horse fellow unit. And these units mainly use crossbows with a shield and a spear. Very, very similar to Chen Royal Guards, except for Chen Royal Guards is largely fictional, and these are actually real units. And they are good additions to Yuan Shao's camp because Yuan Shao is missing shielded infantry. And the point here I want to make is that in game right now, we have too few types of crossbow units, in my opinion. And we have too few types of varieties for shielded units. We need more things similar to the Chen Royal Guard, but not as special or not as heavily statted, because that really represented some of the soldiers at the time. You know, no one really just handed you a spear and said, go charge out there. And spear warriors are just very foolish. Why waste the armor on them if you're going to send them in for suicide missions? And a lot of units were trained for the crossbow. Crossbow was a very popular weapon back in the day. Very easy to use, very easy to assemble, and has very high power and very strong against cavalry. So we should see more units like this. And the art here is another point I want to bring up. This art, as you can see, is by someone called Gingko Story. I pulled this from his art station. I believe he's from Australia and he works for a gaming company, and in his free time he draws certain history-inspired art for a lot of Chinese time period, as well as some Western time period. And he does a lot of Three Kingdom art, and I really like them. And they're very accurate. Like the unit you see here, with the way he wears his armor, his sandals, the way the crossbow is, the sword. Notice how there's a ring at the end of the sword and there's no hand guard in the front. That's the style that was used during this period. So what we're going to do at the end of this is a little free time now that we have talked about my top 5 units that I want to see added in. I want to look at all the art on his art station to give him credit and also talk about some of the cool stuff he did in relation to Three Kingdoms. So let's hop over there. Alrighty, so here we are at Gingko Stories art station. I don't know him personally. I didn't ask him permission for this. I'm just promoting him a little here. Hopefully he doesn't mind me using his material in a video of mine and sharing this to the world in case you don't know him. So we have people like Alexander the Great. He does English and Chinese for all his work. I believe he writes a little bit about them, sometime in both languages. In this one in particular, it's only in English for this part, but you can see English, Chinese, and Japanese as well. He does all sorts of cultural art. And the next one, if we can pull it up. Yes, we can. It went too fast. We have Xiangyu, which is the main opponent for Liu Bang during the founding of the Han, and this would be the famous blade of Xiangyu that Dong Zhuo is using in the game. And he does a bunch of these. But let's go back to the Three Kingdom ones in particular. You see like Joan of Arc, you see like Xitian Xinchang, which is a Japanese general, and so forth. Different cultures. You have, this is Three Kingdoms. Oh, this is a cover art. This is the cover art for his Three Kingdoms series. Yeah, I haven't spent too much time here either, but this is a cool unit that he did for, I think this is Xindongyung. I think his version of Xindongyung, which is the unit we got for Camp Crushers. And this is what he did for that, with the feathers and their decoration. Anyhow, let's go back, because not all of them are in orders. There's a few that I really want to talk about. So this is some, live scenes during the Song Dynasty, I believe. This one's really cool. This one is about the Qinli mountain ranges during the Shu and Wei borders. So this is a symbol for Shu. This is a symbol for Wei. Oh, he translated them. Wonderful. And you see, this is Qinli. All this is mountain. And in particular, there's a very tall peak over here. And you have the Wei River running to Chang'an. And then here you have Meixian, which is where Dong Zhuo was living, and also where the jade mine is in the game. And then here you have Wuzhangyuan. This is where Zhuge Liang eventually would die. Wudu's right here. Qishan's right here. It's a mountain. Tianshui, Jieting. This is also where one of the northern expedition failed. And then you see all these passes that were in existence during that time. Chencang was a very famous one, used during the Chu-Han contention. This is the path that Liu Bang used to leave Shu. As the reason why the Han dynasty is called Han is because this is the Han River, this is Hanzhong, and Liu Bang was originally given this piece of land as his princedom. And then because he became emperor, his entire dynasty was called Han. And he exited Hanzhong from Chencang to go out and defeat Xiangyu. And then these were all the options that Zhuge Liang had, or he could also go west like this through Qishan out into Jieting, which is where he failed with Ma Su, failing to defend this from Zhang He, I believe. And this is Ziwu Guan, or Ziwu Dao. This path is the path that Wei Yan suggested that they take because it's the closest to Chang'an. If you sneak men out of this, it's a short dash straight to Chang'an. Zhuge Liang was very against this. He was very risk averse. He believed that if their route got discovered and the Wei responded by plugging this part here, they would just get massacred. And this was also one of the more underdeveloped routes, very narrow and very rustic. So it wasn't good for supply transports. So essentially what would happen is you would bring enough supplies to get you from point A to point B and hope that you can surprise point B enough to take point B before you run out of supplies, or else you will just basically die here. And Zhuge Liang was not, up for that. You can see many of his approaches more is a step-by-step approach to drag the Wei armies out from where they have good supply to fight farther west, because he took this path multiple times. And Tianshui, even after Zhuge Liang's death, when Jiang Wei took over for the northern expeditions, most of the fighting were in this region. They didn't actually use all these passes most of the time because the defense was also ready. Now, of course, the 5th expedition, where Zhuge Liang would eventually die, did see them make it all the way over to here before Zhuge Liang actually died, which is actually a bit sad if you think about how close they were to Chang'an. But that's kind of the story here. And if you think about the mountains, it's crazy. You think it's hard for Shu to get out, it's hard for Wei to get in. You go through Qinling to get to Hanzhong, to go through another mountain section to get into Shu. So very, very difficult. That's why Shu is usually a very nice piece of land for the founding of different dynasties, because it's very easy to defend, although also very hard to go out. You pretty much need them to have other internal issues to not defend this part as heavily in order to break through and create an opening here around Chang'an. So neat map here. Very, very cool. And if we exit this and go back, he also did characters. So this is Lü Bu, Zhao Yun, Guan Yu with historical weapons. He didn't use the famous dragon crescent blade that did not exist until the Song Dynasty. Zhuge Liang, Diao Chan, fictional character, but one of the 4 beauties, so why not draw her? Dong Zhuo, not as fat. Some Chu Han Qi Bing. So this is just a generic unit art. This will be Hu Qi, which is the tiger cavalry, and this is Bao Qi, or the leopard cavalry. So tiger and leopard are 2 types of units under Cao Cao. Bao Qi, the leopard version, are light cavalry units used for scouting and fast maneuvers. Hu Qi, or the tiger cavalry, are heavy cavalry units that were similar to cataphracts, but not all the way there yet. You need to go towards the Jin dynasty to get full-blown cataphracts into the army. And then you have Zhang Liao right here. Cao Cao, very decked out, tiger fur and all that. Ma Chao, Bai Ma Yi Cong. So this is the white horse fellas. And you can see the white horse and the skilled archery. And the armors are all very well done. He does very good historical research with his armors. Like the collar that you see here was a very common feature during the time, as well as scales like these and the way you wrap it around the clothing underneath. It's not like a full-blown armor, similar to the Western armor. Sometimes you see in a lot of dramas, they kind of go too Western with the armor styles. It's more like flaps of mail that you attach to yourself. This is Xiahou Dun, his art version of Xiahou Dun. Liu Bei, Tai Shi Ci, a little chubby, but he uses a short ji here. That's pretty much what the book goes. And then you have Sun Jian. I wonder if he gave him green eyes, but yeah, let's keep going. Lu Meng, who was a late scholar. Sun Jian wouldn't have green eyes. Sun Quan, where is he, I wonder? Maybe we'll see Sun Quan a bit later. But Sun Quan basically got Lu Meng into reading. And this is the one that I use for Xiandong Si Shi. But he has other ones as well. This is Jie Fan Jun, which means the army that solves worries. And this was kind of the special unit that Sun Quan created later on for the kingdom of Wu. They were sort of the elite force that could solve any worries on the battlefield. And then you have Wudang Fei Jun. So Wudang Fei Jun was a Qiang unit, not Qiang unit, Nanman unit that joined the Shu army after Zhuge Liang defeated Meng Huo during the southern expedition. And they were very good units in the mountains. They were very fast. So Fei Jun, the flying army, and Wudang means none can stand in their way. It's kind of just the nickname people give them. Now, many of these units are very romanticized. Someone in literature wrote them. Later generation just made them really fancy because they had a really fancy name, as things often happen. And then here we have what's known as 木牛流马, which is Zhuge Liang's invention of these automated supply transports. And no one know what they were. They were designed to look like cows and horses, and they could apparently move on their own. That part's definitely fictional. What mostly happened was probably something like this, where you designed a machinery to make traveling in the mountains a bit easier and to supply your armies a bit more efficiently. Zhuge Liang was a pretty good inventor, but automated machines, not during the third century there. Liu Shan, and then you have Shu's officials, you have Shu's musicians. This one's pretty interesting. 大几世. This is another Yuan Shao specialty, and this is pretty much the unit that we have in game. Those heavy Ji units that Yuan Shao have, Defender of Hebei, comes from these 大几世. And they were units under the command of Zhang He, who hopefully will get a unique artwork for very soon. But these were pretty much used as inspirations for the heavy Ji units. So it is based on history. It's unfortunate that they cannot use a shield because they use a long Ji over here. Then we have, Bai Bing. So these are the white feather veterans that Liu Bei had. Now they shouldn't be so rustic like this. This one kind of has more of a Nanman flair. They did not come from the Shu region. The Bai Bing were units that were veterans that followed Liu Bei since the very early days in Xuzhou. So they're probably, Xuzhou veterans, and they were just basically through all those campaigns that Liu Bei was on, and they made it all the way into Shu. So by that time, they're super experienced units, and they had these white feather decorating their helm. Therefore, they were called Bai Bing. Definitely an elite unit. They were in charge of cutting off the retreat to help Liu Bei's army pull away from Lianying after it was burned. And they have some, farmers. Xindongyung, camp crushers, is take on them. And you notice all the swords. That circle design, very accurate. And then we have Qingzhou Bing. So this would be Cao Cao's main force. It would be a group of 30,000 yellow turbans that kind of joined Cao Cao early on, and that was kind of his elite force during the early periods of the Three Kingdoms. Then what do we have here? These are not. These are during the Hubilei, so this will be during the Yuan dynasty. Yeah, Song dynasty defense. Some Japanese clothing styles. Ming dynasty clothing styles. This one is the Imperial Army of the Wu Kingdom and all their supplies. These are really, really neat. He has the English and Chinese versions. Lucky Charm. I wonder if he pulled this from a museum wall, because I feel like this is usually how museums design them, because he does use inspirational art, because I can pinpoint one a bit later, which is one that I know very, very well. But you can see you have all sorts of different weapons. This is a hand ji or a short ji. You basically hold it here, and a close range weapon that you would use. Short sword. This would be the long version that I talked about, usually around at least a meter long, if not 1.2. And they're used to combat cavalry. This one's more of a close quarter weapon, probably around 60 to 70 centimeters long. And then bows were used a lot during the South because they had to use it for naval combat. Very, very cool stuff. And if we go back, we have Zhuge Liang's northern expedition troops. So this will be Kingdom of Shu, and the weaponry will be a little bit more different. Zhuge Liang really liked crossbows. He also invented some repeating crossbows. You even have sandals, storage of food, armor, shield, all sorts of different swords, different polearms. You also have a football, so more of a soccer variety. These were much smaller. They played a game very similar to soccer back in those days. If anyone's seen the movie Chibi, it was featured in that, and it was a very competitive game played by a lot of soldiers at camp. And let's go back. There's a few more I want to touch on, and for those of you who want to enjoy this, just go search up Gingko Story on ArtStation, and you can see all of these. And if you want to support him, I believe he sells a couple prints as well. And then these are not really Three Kingdom related, except for this one. This would be the supply line of the Shu army during their northern expedition. Those northern expeditions are not easy trips. You had to exit Qinling to go try to fight the Wei army, and then you had to retreat back 5 times. It does take a toll. And yeah, you see the repeating crossbowman right here? It has a stack of ammo holding underneath. These just had really, really bad range. I think historically they shoot about 30 meters. Very good taking care of bandits and other small issues. Not super efficient on long-range battlefield against cavalry, but a very good weapon nonetheless, but it fell out of favor after Zhuge Liang's death because of its limited capacity. Zhuge Liang liked to use them for ambushes, basically. All right, one more art I want to show before we end this. He did another art, one that if you followed our Crusader Kings series, you might find this very familiar. So this was a cave painting on Dunhuang, Dunhuang Shiku, which is a region in northwest China. And they had these cave paintings. Now, obviously, the cave painting wouldn't be as detailed as his version here, but this depicts the Sogodan people leaving the Tang Dynasty after a merchant trip on the Silk Road. And if you notice this flag here, this is a flag of Gui Yijun, which is what we played for our Crusader Kings campaign. So the Gui circuit who returned to Tang. So this would be during the end of the Tang Dynasty here. Sogodans marry into the Han people that form Gui Yijun. The Cao clan of that group was actually of Sogodan descent, who took on a more Han last name. And you can see the details that kind of match what we had in the Dunhuang picture. And the thumb art that I used for our Crusader King series is this exact same art. And he has a much cuter depiction of it, I would say. And I think he sells this as a print. So yeah, that's it. Check out him on the site. I don't know if he would mind us using his art, but I just want to talk about some of the cool things here and also some of the weaponry that was used during the time. And that's going to do it for this episode of the top 5. We'll come back next time and talk about some more game mechanic. Even though we already kind of touched upon that in this one when we talked about battle mechanic, we'll talk more about other types of mechanics in that one. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye!